The story of terrible Terry Allen does not begin on a battlefield. It begins with a boy who simply refused to follow rules. Born in Fort Douglas, Utah, in 1890, Terry Allen grew up in the shadow of the U.S. Army. His father was a cavalry officer, a stern man who believed discipline made soldiers and men. But young Terry had a different fire in him. He didn't crave order. He craved challenge, movement, danger. At West Point, Allen's restless spirit clashed with military tradition. He broke regulations, skipped formalities, and laughed in the face of authority. The academy tried to mold him into a perfect officer, but Allen resisted every step. After endless disciplinary reports, he was expelled, an almost career-ending disgrace. Yet destiny wasn't done with him. Through persistence and sheer charm, Allen managed to reapply and finally graduate, though still remembered as one of West Point's most troublesome cadets. His first real test came not in textbooks, but in the chaos of Mexico in 1916. Serving under General John J. Pershing during the punitive expedition, Allen saw combat against Pancho Villa's guerrillas. There, under the desert sun, he discovered something that no academy could teach. He was born for battle. Where others hesitated, Allen advanced. Where fear spread, he laughed. It was the beginning of a reputation that would follow him for decades. A commander who thrived in the worst conditions imaginable. When World War I erupted, Allen again took to the field. But this time, bureaucracy became his enemy. His energy, his improvisation, his disregard for rigid hierarchy, they made traditional officers nervous. He was often pushed to staff work, away from direct command. It infuriated him. Terry Allen didn't want to sit behind a desk. He wanted to lead men face to face under fire. Between the wars, while many officers focused on promotions and politics, Allen studied soldiers, not strategy. He learned what made ordinary men fight, what broke them, and what inspired them to go beyond human limits. He trained his mind and body relentlessly, and his charisma drew loyalty from the roughest recruits. To them, he wasn't a distant officer in a polished uniform. He was one of them. He cursed, sweated, and bled beside his troops. By the late 1930s, the world was again sliding toward darkness. And this time, the U.S. Army needed more than polished parade ground officers. It needed fighters. Allen, already in his 50s, was ready. His age didn't matter. His fire hadn't dimmed a bit. In 1940, he took command of the 1st Infantry Division, the legendary Big Red One. The Army, uncertain about his rough style, watched him closely. His men adored him. His superiors worried about him. They said he was too wild, too informal, too reckless. Allen didn't care. He trained the Big Red One not just to march, but to win. Day and night, he drilled them until discipline became instinct and courage became reflex. Those early years forged the bond that would define his legend. Soldiers began calling him Terrible Terry, not out of hate, but awe. He was terrible to the enemy, relentless in training, and unshakably loyal to his men. By the time America entered World War II, Terry Allen had already become a myth whispered across camps. Some said he never slept. Others swore he could sense enemy movements before they happened. But to the men who followed him, he was simply the general. He wasn't the kind of leader who shouted orders from a hill. He fought shoulder to shoulder with his soldiers, shared their meals, their mud, and their fear. That made him different. That made him dangerous. And somewhere in North Africa, far across the sea, German officers were about to learn his name and never forget it, because Terrible Terry Allen was coming. And wherever he went, hell followed. Terry Allen was not the kind of officer the Army wanted, but he was exactly the kind it needed when the world went to war. By the early 1940s, America was preparing for its greatest fight in history. Across the Atlantic, Hitler's forces had overrun Europe. The old rules of warfare were dead. Allen understood this better than anyone. He believed wars were not won by discipline alone, but by spirit, by men who trusted their commander as much as their rifle. He drilled his soldiers hard, yes, but he led harder. When others sat behind maps and radios, Allen was in the mud, shouting orders, laughing in the chaos, living every second with his troops. The 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, became an extension of his will. They trained under scorching sun and freezing rain, crawling through dust, assaulting hills again and again until exhaustion was no longer pain but routine. Allen's philosophy was simple. If my men must bleed in battle, they must first sweat in training. But his leadership style caused friction with higher command. General George S. Patton admired Allen's courage but despised his looseness. Allen allowed his soldiers to relax off duty, to drink, to joke, to feel human. Patton saw it as weakness. Allen saw it as strength. "The men fight for you," he would say. "Not for rules, not for medals, for you." And they did. His troops worshipped him. To them, he wasn't Major General Allen. He was simply Terry, the kind of leader who'd walk into a foxhole, light a cigarette, and say, "How you holding up, son?" He remembered every name, every scar, every story. He gave them faith when the world offered nothing but fear. In 1942, as the U.S. finally entered the war, Allen's division was among the first chosen for overseas deployment. They were heading to North Africa, Operation Torch. The Big Red One would land in Algeria and fight the battle-hardened German Afrika Korps, led by none other than Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself. It was a brutal assignment. Many American units had never faced real combat. But Allen knew his men were ready. "They'll be scared," he told his officers. And that's good. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing your duty despite it. As the invasion fleet crossed the Atlantic, Allen walked the decks at night, talking with his soldiers, telling stories, calming nerves. He had a strange gift. He made men believe they couldn't lose. Not because of blind optimism, but because they trusted him. The landings began at dawn. Under the blinding North African sun, German shells rained down as American troops scrambled ashore. Chaos erupted, men shouting, tanks burning, radios dead. In that confusion, Allen didn't hide behind cover. He stood tall, moving through gunfire, directing men by hand signals, his voice cutting through explosions like thunder. One private later said, "If the general could walk through hell like that, we sure as hell could follow." That was Allen's magic, not strategy, not speeches, presence. He didn't just command respect. He inspired it. Even enemy observers began to take notice. German intelligence reports from late 1942 described an American general who fights like a frontline soldier. But that ferocity came with a cost. Allen's informality and his refusal to bow to hierarchy angered his superiors. Reports began circulating about undisciplined behavior in his division. Allen brushed it off. "I train men to fight," he said, "not to polish boots." In truth, he was redefining leadership itself. He believed that true command came from trust, not fear. His soldiers didn't just obey orders, they believed in them. By the end of 1942, the Big Red One had earned its reputation. They were bloodied, battered, and victorious, the first American division to stand toe-to-toe with the best of the German army and not break. Allen had proven something the world was only beginning to understand. Discipline can be taught, but courage must be led. And Terry Allen, the restless cadet who once defied West Point, had become the embodiment of American fighting spirit. He wasn't perfect, and he didn't pretend to be, but to his men he was invincible. The Germans had a new name on their list, Not Patton, not Eisenhower. It was terrible Terry Allen. And soon they would learn why. The morning sun over North Africa burned like fire. It was November 8, 1942, the beginning of Operation Torch, America's first major offensive against Nazi Germany. For many soldiers, it was their first time hearing enemy gunfire. For Major General Terry Allen and his men of the 1st Infantry Division, it was the day everything they had trained for would be tested in blood. The landings at Oran, Algeria were chaos from the start. Waves of landing craft crashed through rough seas, spilling men into cold, hostile water. German and Vichy French artillery roared from the hills. Communications broke down, and confusion spread. But in that confusion, Terry Allen was calm, almost unnervingly calm. He waded ashore under fire, his boots heavy with seawater and sand, waving his men forward. "Get moving," he shouted. "We didn't come all this way to stop now." Bullets hissed overhead, mortars burst nearby, but Allen never ducked. To the men of the Big Red One, his fearlessness was like a shield. Within hours, American forces pushed inland, meeting fierce resistance. The French defenders fought stubbornly until they realized they were facing overwhelming odds. Oran finally fell after 2 brutal days. The U.S. Army had its first real victory in the European theater, but Allen knew it was only the beginning. Their next challenge was far deadlier: Tunisia. Here, the Americans would face the Afrika Korps, commanded by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, a master of desert warfare. His panzers moved with speed and precision, striking like serpents in the sand. The Germans were veterans, the Americans inexperienced. Allen understood what they were walking into. He told his officers, "We'll make mistakes, but we'll learn fast or we'll die." In late November, the Big Red One advanced through the barren, wind-swept desert. Supplies ran thin, vehicles broke down, and the scorching sun punished every move. Still, Allen refused to slow down. He rode in an open jeep at the front lines, dust coating his face, binoculars always in hand. To him, leadership wasn't about giving orders from safety, it was about being seen. The first major clash came near Kasserine Pass. The Germans hit hard and fast. American lines buckled. Tanks burned. Radios went silent. Men scattered in confusion. But Allen didn't retreat. He regrouped his troops, reorganized his artillery, and counterattacked under the cover of night. A bold, almost reckless move. When dawn broke, the Americans still held their ground. A captured German officer later admitted, "We were surprised. Your general fights like one of his own men." Allen's battlefield style was raw and direct. He used instinct more than doctrine, often ignoring higher orders if he thought they were wrong. His men adored it. His superiors didn't. But the results spoke for themselves. The Big Red One was gaining experience, discipline, and confidence with every engagement. By early 1943, they were hardened veterans. They had seen death, failure, and victory, sometimes all in a single day. Allen had forged them into a fighting force the Germans began to respect, even fear. Reports from German intelligence described an American general who leads from the front and never hides. They called his division unpredictable, aggressive, and dangerous. Allen wore that reputation like a medal. Still, every victory came with a price. The desert claimed many lives. Allen visited the wounded himself, kneeling beside stretchers, sharing water, whispering words of pride and comfort. He never forgot a face. When asked how he could bear so much loss, he replied quietly, "You don't get used to it. You just get stronger because they deserve it." By the spring of 1943, the campaign was turning. The Americans, once green and untested, now stood shoulder to shoulder with the British, pushing Rommel's forces back toward Tunisia's coast. The desert, once a graveyard for novices, had become a proving ground for warriors. And at the center of it all was Terry Allen, the man who taught ordinary soldiers to believe they could do the impossible. North Africa was his baptism by fire, and from those flames, a legend was born. A general both loved by his men and feared by his enemies. The Germans now knew the truth. The Americans had found their fighter, and his name was Terrible Terry Allen. When the dust of North Africa began to settle, a new kind of legend was emerging in the U.S. Army. One wearing a sun-faded uniform, a crooked grin, and a reputation that scared both enemies and generals alike. Major General Terry Allen had proven that the Americans could fight, but what made him unforgettable wasn't just victory. It was how he led. Allen believed that command didn't come from rank or ribbons. It came from respect. He lived among his men, slept in the same dirt, ate the same rations, and risked the same bullets. To him, a general's place was not behind lines with binoculars, but beside his soldiers under fire. Every morning, before the first light of dawn, Allen would move through the camps. He spoke to privates and sergeants by name, checked their weapons, and cracked jokes to cut the tension. When morale dipped, he reminded them, "You're the best damn soldiers in this desert, and the Germans know it." That attitude built something discipline alone never could: loyalty. His men didn't fight because they had to. They fought because he did. But Allen's informal style infuriated higher command. Reports described him as too casual, too close to the enlisted men, even unmilitary. General Patton, ever the perfectionist, despised Allen's looseness. He wanted soldiers who saluted sharply and spoke softly. Allen wanted soldiers who shot straight and thought fast. The clash between the two was inevitable. Patton once visited Allen's headquarters and was horrified to see soldiers with open collars, dirty boots, and cigars in their mouths. "This is not an army," Patton growled. Allen smiled and replied, "Maybe not, General, but it's one hell of a fighting outfit." Allen's philosophy was simple. Men who respect you will fight for you longer than men who fear you. He proved it every day. His troops marched farther, fought harder, and recovered faster than most divisions. They trusted their commander even when chaos reigned. At the Battle of El Getter in March 1943, that trust would be tested to its limit. Rommel struck with tanks and artillery, trying to crush the Americans before they could regroup. Allen refused to retreat. He walked the front lines as shells exploded around him, shouting orders, rallying his men by sheer presence. "Hold your ground," he bellowed. "We've come too far to run now." And they did hold. The Germans, expecting an easy victory, were stunned by the Americans' stubborn defense. The 1st Infantry Division, Allen's big red one, stood firm and pushed them back. It was the turning point of the North African campaign. For that victory, Allen received praise from Eisenhower himself. Yet behind closed doors, his methods still drew criticism. Patton's reports described Allen's division as effective but lacking discipline. Eisenhower was torn. He admired Allen's results but feared his defiance of military convention. Allen didn't care. "I wasn't hired to polish soldiers," he told a reporter. "I was hired to win wars." He believed leadership wasn't about perfection, it was about connection. He didn't see soldiers as numbers or ranks but as men, each with fear, courage, and pride. That human approach was radical in a war machine built on hierarchy and obedience. But it worked. His men began carrying photos of Allen in their pockets for luck. They painted his name on tanks. They followed him through sandstorms, through artillery fire, through hell itself, because they knew he'd never ask them to go anywhere he wouldn't go first. To many generals, Allen was a troublemaker. To his men, he was the soul of the division. By the time Tunisia fell in May 1943, the 1st Infantry Division had become one of the most respected and feared units in the entire Allied army. They had earned their legend through blood and sacrifice, and Allen had redefined what it meant to lead in war. Not from behind a desk, but from the dirt, the smoke, and the fear. He didn't lead by orders. He led by example. And in doing so, Terrible Terry Allen had changed the very meaning of command forever. By the summer of 1943, the deserts of North Africa had fallen silent. The Axis forces were retreating, and victory banners were being raised. But for Major General Terry Allen, the real battle was just beginning, not against the Germans, but against his own chain of command. Allen's Big Red One had become a legend, tough, fearless, and loyal to the core. Yet behind the scenes, whispers grew louder. Some officers praised him as a genius of morale. Others called him reckless, insubordinate, even dangerous. The problem was simple. Allen's leadership broke every rule in the book, and not everyone liked that. When General George S. Patton assumed command in North Africa, the clash was inevitable. Patton was a man of order, obsessed with discipline and appearances. To him, war was as much about image as victory. His soldiers stood straight, polished boots shining even in the desert. Allen's men? They looked like a gang of outlaws. Dusty uniforms, unshaven faces, helmets scuffed by battle. To Patton, it was unacceptable. To Allen, it was reality. "They fight like hell," Allen said. "That's all that matters." Their confrontation came to a head in May 1943 during an inspection of the 1st Infantry Division. Patton stormed into the camp, fuming at what he saw. Relaxed soldiers, laughter around campfires, cigarettes dangling from lips. He demanded an explanation. Allen simply shrugged. "They've earned it, sir," he replied. "Every man here's faced death. A little rest won't break them." Patton's eyes blazed. "You're soft, Allen. You let them run wild." Allen shot back without hesitation. "They follow me into battle, General. That's all the discipline I need." It was a line that would echo through history and cost him dearly. Allen's methods produced results, but they embarrassed the more traditional generals. Rumors spread that his men were uncontrolled and unfit for garrison life. Eisenhower, though privately fond of Allen, began receiving pressure from Washington to restore order within the ranks. The army wanted soldiers who looked like soldiers, not warriors caked in sand and smoke. Meanwhile, Allen's men continued to adore him. They'd follow him anywhere. To them, he was the heart of the division. He had turned civilians into fighters and fear into fury. But loyalty in war can be dangerous, especially when it challenges hierarchy. In July 1943, as the Allies prepared to invade Sicily, tensions reached a breaking point. Patton demanded stricter control, cleaner camps, and sharper discipline. Allen resisted, insisting that morale was more important than ceremony. "These aren't parade troops," he said. "They're killers, and that's what wins wars." The invasion of Sicily only deepened the divide. Under Allen's command, the 1st Infantry Division fought brilliantly, capturing towns and driving the Germans north. Yet behind closed doors, reports from Patton's headquarters painted a different picture: of chaos, of lax discipline, of a general who refused to conform. By late July, the decision was made. Allen was relieved of command of the 1st Infantry Division. Officially, it was called a routine rotation. In truth, it was punishment, the Army's way of silencing a man who wouldn't bend. When the news reached his men, disbelief turned to anger. Some wept openly. Others swore they'd refuse to fight without him. Allen gathered them quietly and said, "You don't fight for me. You fight for each other. You fight for the Big Red One." He saluted them one last time, the same soldiers he had led from green recruits to hardened warriors, and then walked away without looking back. Patton had won the bureaucratic battle. But on the ground, among the soldiers, it was Allen's name that lived on. His leadership had forged an unbreakable brotherhood, one that no order could erase. As the convoy carried him away from Sicily, Allen looked out over the burning horizon. He had lost his command, but not his purpose. "They can take my division," he muttered, "but they can't take what we built." He was down but far from defeated, because for terrible Terry Allen, war was never about politics. It was about men, courage, and the will to keep fighting no matter who tried to stop him. When Terry Allen left Sicily in 1943, it felt like exile. One moment he was leading the most battle-hardened division in the U.S. Army. The next, he was out, quietly removed from command. No farewell ceremony, no medals, no fanfare. Just orders. The Army called it rotation. Allen knew better. He'd been pushed aside. The generals wanted tidy uniforms and polished boots. Allen had given them grit, chaos, and victory, and for that he was punished. For months, he drifted between headquarters, buried under paperwork and silence. He was a general without a command, a fighter trapped in a cage of bureaucracy. The newspapers still praised the Big Red One, but few mentioned the man who had shaped it. He read about their victories with pride and pain. Still, he refused to fade away. Allen was no politician, but he understood soldiers. And somewhere in the Pacific, another storm was brewing. One that would soon need men like him. In early 1944, opportunity came knocking. The U.S. Army needed a commander to rebuild the shattered 104th Infantry Division, the Timberwolves. The unit was inexperienced, untested, and short on confidence. Allen accepted instantly. His second chance had arrived. From the moment he took command, the old fire returned. He trained the Timberwolves the same way he had molded the Big Red One, hard, fast, and personal. "You fight as you train," he told them. "So we'll train like hell." Under his leadership, the 104th transformed. He threw out unnecessary drills and focused on what mattered: movement, marksmanship, and trust. He learned every soldier's name. He walked the camps at night, listening, talking, making them believe they were the best, because soon they'd have to be. In September 1944, Allen and his new division landed in France. Their mission: push into Germany through Holland's brutal autumn rains. The enemy was experienced, desperate, and fighting on home soil. The Timberwolves were about to face their trial by fire. What followed was a campaign that stunned even Allen's critics. The 104th fought like veterans, advancing through flooded fields, clearing towns under fire, crossing rivers at night. They earned a reputation for relentless determination and deadly precision. German reports began to mention a familiar name: Allen's Wolves. They remembered him from North Africa, the terrible general whose men never stopped coming. Now he was back, leading a new breed of killers. Allen's command style hadn't changed. He was still close to the front, still muddy, still unshaven. He laughed with his soldiers, cursed with them, and bled with them. And once again it worked. The Timberwolves became one of the most respected divisions on the Western Front. As they advanced through Belgium and into Germany, Allen's redemption became undeniable. The same army that had cast him aside now praised his brilliance. Reports described his leadership as inspiring, his tactics innovative, his discipline exceptional. But for Allen, redemption wasn't about reputation. It was about proving that his way, the soldier's way, still mattered. He had never cared for politics or promotion. What drove him was simple: bringing his men home alive and breaking the enemy before the dawn. In April 1945, as the war neared its end, The Timberwolves helped liberate Dachau's satellite camps, confronting horrors beyond imagination. Allen stood among the prisoners, silent, shaken. It was a moment that stripped away the last romantic illusions of war. Even the terrible general bowed his head. By May, Germany had surrendered. The Timberwolves had marched more than 600 miles, fought in over 190 days of continuous combat, and liberated thousands. Their success was a testament, not just to Allen's tactics, but to his unshakable belief in his men. The army that once rejected him now celebrated him. But Allen never asked for applause. When reporters called him a hero, he simply said, "The heroes are buried in the mud." For Terry Allen, exile had turned to redemption. Not through politics, not through glory, but through the loyalty of men who fought and died under his command. He had fallen once, but rose again, proving that true leadership isn't about rank or rules. It's about trust, courage, and the will to keep fighting, no matter who doubts you. As the guns of Europe fell silent, Allen walked among his soldiers one last time. He smiled and said, "You Timberwolves did good." Then, with quiet pride, he turned toward the setting sun, a soldier redeemed by the very battlefield that once broke him. When Terry Allen took command of the 104th Infantry Division, most of its men had never seen combat. They were young, uncertain, and far from home, a far cry from the grizzled veterans of the Big Red One. But Allen saw something familiar in their eyes, the same spark of raw courage he'd once forged in the sands of North Africa. He had been cast out by the Army's high command, branded too rough, too undisciplined. But the war wasn't over, and the battlefield had a way of forgiving men who could win. The Timberwolves would be his second chance. From the moment Allen took charge, everything changed. He tore down the barriers between officers and men. He walked the training grounds, sleeves rolled up, boots caked in mud. "If I'm dry and you're wet," he told them, "then I'm not doing my job." His philosophy was simple. Trust your men, fight smart, and never waste a life. The Timberwolves trained relentlessly under his command. Night marches, live-fire drills, small unit tactics. Allen's mantra echoed across every camp: "We fight as we train." By the fall of 1944, they were ready. The 104th landed in France, attached to the Canadian First Army, tasked with pushing the Germans out of Holland. The weather was miserable, endless rain, mud up to the knees, visibility near zero. But Allen turned those hardships into lessons. "This is perfect Timberwolf weather," he growled. "The darker it gets, the harder we bite." The men laughed and believed him. Their first major engagement came near Wensdrecht, a small Dutch town guarding the approach to Antwerp. German resistance was fierce, but the Timberwolves fought with a precision that stunned even seasoned commanders. They moved through the night, cutting through defenses with speed and discipline. It was Allen's trademark: strike hard, strike smart, and never stop. Soon, reports began to spread across Allied lines. "The Timberwolves don't sleep. They advanced at night, when the enemy least expected them," earning the nickname the Night Fighters. Under Allen's leadership, the division liberated dozens of towns across Holland and northern Germany. Each victory carried his unmistakable stamp: bold tactics, minimum casualties, and ironclad morale. His men adored him. To them, Allen wasn't just a general. He was their general, a man who shared their rations, walked their patrols, and looked them in the eye before every battle. One soldier later recalled, "When Terry Allen said we could take that town, you believed it, because he'd be the first one through the gate." By March 1945, the Timberwolves reached the Rhine River, one of the last great barriers before Germany's heartland. Crossing it under fire, Allen coordinated one of the most efficient assaults of the entire Western Front. Within days, the enemy line shattered. The division pressed forward, capturing city after city, liberating thousands of civilians in their path. As the 104th advanced deeper into Germany, they discovered the grim remains of Nazi brutality: forced labor camps, shattered villages, starving survivors. Allen, hardened by years of war, stood silent among the ruins. He ordered his men to bring food, water, and medical aid. "No one under my command," he said, "turns their back on the helpless." In those final months of the war, the Timberwolves' reputation soared. Eisenhower himself called the division a model of combat effectiveness. The same army that had once dismissed Allen as a rogue now praised his command as textbook leadership. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Timberwolves had fought for 195 consecutive days, captured over 12,000 prisoners, and advanced 600 miles across Europe. Their discipline, precision, and courage became legendary, a living testament to the man who had rebuilt them from scratch. For Terry Allen, this was his true redemption, not in medals or headlines, but in the eyes of the soldiers who followed him to hell and back. When reporters asked how he turned an untested division into one of the best in Europe, Allen simply smiled and said, "Give a man purpose, give him trust, and he'll give you victory." As the war ended, Allen walked among the Timberwolves one last time. The men cheered, but he only nodded quietly. The job was done. His glory wasn't in the applause. It was in knowing he had led his men with honor. He had fallen once, but the Timberwolves had brought him back. Terry Allen, the soldier's general, the man the Germans feared and the army tried to tame, had returned to glory.